Please sit down. And would you turn your Bibles to Romans chapter 6? We're working our way through the letter to the Romans. And we're in chapter 6. So let's pray first. Father, we ask that you'll help us to understand this scripture better. Pray that you might speak to each of us, encourage us, build us up, stir us up. Give us a clear understanding of what you want to say to us today, and especially lead us into action from what Paul talks about in this passage. Pray that the evil one will not interrupt us, confuse us, but we'll be able to hear what you have to say. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. So many murders. The news has been full of this murder or that murder or another murder. And not just murders, of course, but all sorts of other terrible things have been described and are described week by week in our news. A report this morning, research done in South Australia, suggests that 1 in 4 children in South Australia have been abused in their homes or in their extended families. We're in a huge battle in our society, a kind of a civil war, humans at war with themselves, changing groups and fighting others. Sometimes it's just in our own personal life, of course. For some, there are a whole variety of addictions, not illegal necessarily, some of them, but things that weigh us down. There's just bad behaviour. Some of us are suffering from mental health issues, some of which are caused by other people. Some of them are just part of life. Families are in trouble and in strife. This week there's news again about elder abuse. There's going to be a Royal Commission into aged care, the Prime Minister says. Family violence is continuing. Lots of people have poor life expectancies and poor life experiences. Conflict in general affects many families. Relationships are difficult. Some people don't have very good relationships. They're just isolated or excluded. Suicide hasn't diminished. And whether you play sport or at work, you'll find that there are lots of difficulties and conflicts in relationships, even in those places where they ought to be good. In church, of course, whatever church you think of, this one, churches large and small, there's conflict, tugging, pushing, competing. And in society, of course, public corruption. Another Royal Commission will show more about it. Social engineering through legislation continues. Social media and bullying is increasing and is endemic in our society now. Well, it's all a bit dismal, isn't it? There's good news today. I want to tell you some good news about all this stuff. Because, you see, we understand the underlying causes of all these things. We understand that the underlying cause has to do with our nature as humans. The Bible calls it sin. It's a sinful nature. It's what is excused in the public discourse as our human nature. This is just my human nature. Well, that's correct. It is our human nature, a nature that's in rebellion against God, that has abandoned and pushed God out to the side or all the way away from our lives, and the result, of course, is all the kinds of things that we have. It's a rebellious nature that ends in death and constructs a life that is oriented and heading towards death all the time. Is there any help? If you understand the cause, what's the cure? Well, the cure is mentioned a few times in Galatians, and we touched on it last week, or we might have done more than touch on it. It's to do with God's grace. There it is right at the end of Romans 5, but repeated quite a few times in Romans 5. Where sin increased, grace increased all the more. So that just as sin reigned in death, so also grace might reign through righteousness to bring eternal life through Jesus Christ. Now, is this grace, and this is a question Paul asks at the beginning of question 6, Is this grace, this free forgiveness, this justification because of the death of Christ, is this basically just a get out of jail free card? You can keep on doing what you like and you know you'll be forgiven anyway. Well, Paul says no, that's not the case at all. Is it freedom from something? Yes, it's certainly freedom. The grace of God that comes to us through Christ and his death and resurrection brings us a freedom from the corruption of our nature. Come back to that. But it's also a freedom to do something. It's not just freedom from, but freedom to. Freedom to do what? Well, for a change, to serve God, to love God, to live for God. We'll see that in this passage. Now, Paul immediately in the beginning of chapter 6 focuses on baptism. Baptism, he says, focuses what the issue is about how to get the help when the corrupt nature continues to mess up our lives and our lives of our society. Now, for some of us, our baptism happened a long time distant from that time in our life when we decided that we would obey Jesus, repent of our sins, put our lives in his hands, trust him to forgive us, commit ourselves to serving him as our Lord. For some people, those two things were quite close together in their adult life. For others, they were baptized as a baby, they didn't know what was going on, and it wasn't until later on, as a teenager or as an adult, that they decided that what was promised in the baptism, that would be for them. Paul here is talking about baptism that represents that connecting yourself with Christ by your own decision. The baptism focuses on how God's grace helps us because it tells us, and this is verse 3 and 4, that our baptism was a baptism into Christ's death. Sometimes when people talk about getting baptized, they say, well, does this make me an Anglican? No, in our church, or most of the churches, you're baptized into Christ, not into the Anglican church or anything. But this is not just being baptized into Christ, it's being baptized into his death. So the symbolism of baptism going down into the water as a burial and coming up as a resurrection is what is behind the imagery here. It's a baptism into Christ's death. So verse 4, so it means we died and were buried with Christ. That's what baptism is pointing to. So verse 4, we might be raised with Christ to a new life. Verse 4, raised to a new life. Now verses 5 to 10 basically expand that, clarify, tell us more about it, and particularly focuses on the future of the resurrection that God is going to accomplish because we belong to Christ. But the key here is verse 10. The death Christ died, he died to sin once for all, but the life he lives to God. The death he died was a death to sin once for all. And the life he lives to God. Now Paul is saying we were baptized into that, into Christ who died and was raised. And so because his death was a death for us, and our baptism connects us with that, the baptism brings to us a promise of pardon and new life from God. Baptism represents the promise of forgiveness and new life. That's from God's point of view. He's offering it to us as a little acted out thing that says, if you submit to this, with it comes forgiveness and new life. From our point of view, this is how we recognize and receive and submit to God's promise. God has promised forgiveness, new life, because of the death of Jesus. And baptism is the way we outwardly act that out. We say to God, we believe this. So I want now, in being baptized, to go down into the death with Christ in order to be raised with Christ, because the baptism is linking me, connecting me to Christ, because I'm submitting to God's grace that has come to me through the death of Christ in the gospel. So baptism, if you like, is an acted out way of saying we're connecting ourselves with Christ in his death and resurrection. Is that the foundation of your life so far? That at some point in your life, whether it was in your baptism or not, that you've connected yourself willfully, wholeheartedly, given yourself into Christ in his death so that you can be raised to a new life with him. Because that's the foundation of the Christian life. If you haven't done that, you're not a believer, you're not a Christian. You have to be connecting yourself with Jesus in his death. Baptism represents that and is an active way of doing it. Whether that happened at your baptism or not, maybe it doesn't matter. But whether you did it personally with Christ, that's the thing. So the implication of this, you see, is that we died. We died on the cross because Christ died for us. We died in our baptism, or what was representing in our baptism, when we decided that we would link ourselves and connect ourselves with Christ and submit to him as the one who rescues us and rules us. And we died to Christ, we died to ourselves every day. That's part of it. The second implication is not just we've died, but that Christ is living in us, that Christ will bring us new life, that Christ has brought us new life. The new life has come to us through Christ because we've connected ourselves and believed the promise. Now, how does that lead to a happy life? And how is that good news for a civil war society? The help consists in new humans living a new life in Christ. So verses 11 to 14. Recognise and reckon that you are dead to sin. That is, you are dead to your human nature because you put it to death and linked it and trusted Christ's death to be your death. And recognise and reckon and live as though you are alive to God in Christ. That's what he says in verse 11 onwards. Count yourselves, recognise that that's the reality now, because that's what baptism represents. Verse 12, don't let sin rule in your life anymore. Verse 13, don't offer yourselves as instruments of wickedness. Verse 13, offer yourselves and all the parts of yourself to God as instruments of righteousness. Well, that's pretty simple, isn't it? Verses 12 and 13, don't let this rule, offer yourselves to God. Well, this is just more advice. More advice. You come to church, that's what you get, lots of advice. Is this just more advice? Well, it is at one level, but you see, the key is, there are two keys to this to work out how this works. You need to go back to the beginning and say, this is a life lived under grace. This is a life, the foundation of which depends on God's help in the first place of freeing us from judgment and the power of sin because of the death of Jesus. It's God's gracious act in the death of Christ that allows us to be in this position where we could possibly not let sin rule, not let the corrupt nature win all the time. But the second part is the real crucial thing. That is, the key is, because we are with Christ, in Christ, baptised into Christ, baptised into his death. All of this stuff here is because we are with Christ, raised with Christ, a new life with Christ. It all depends on our relationship with Christ. You see, God sees us as alive in Christ. That's how God sees it. And God will raise us with Christ, never to die again. But in the present, God has given you a new life in Christ because you belong to him. In other words, Christ is living his life in us. And we live our lives in Christ. He lives his life in us. He is our life. And therefore we can live to God because we belong to Christ. That's the crucial bit, you see. Christ in you, you in Christ, his life. So the first thing that this means is that because Christ is in us through his Spirit and his Word, he's protecting us and helping us against all the corruption of our own nature. All those things that we keep on doing that we don't want to be doing. And all that passivity that doesn't do what we ought to be doing. It's Christ in us, by his Spirit and his Word, that helps us not just be protected from doing bad things, but actually transforming our behaviour. Now we're going to talk more about that in a couple of weeks' time, and John Gilmore's going to pick those up, the last part of Romans 6, where there's more about that. In Christ, Christ in us helps us to live the life, a transformed life. But it also does something else. Because Christ is living his life in us, we are bringing his life into our relationships. We are bringing his life into our community. One of the really big problems in the society we're living in is the lack of community. More and more you listen to people and there's no group around them who can help them. We lived in Highgate for 14 years and ran soup kitchens, and we had people knocking on our door all the time, and drug addicts in the backyards shooting up, and people too drunk to walk home had to call the police, so they'd walk out onto Beaufort Street and get knocked over. But no community. The mental health services had put lots of mental health patients out into the community, which wasn't there. They were wandering around, back on drugs and whatever. It's one of the big deals. And the corruption of our community and the corruptions of our family life are things that can be changed by people who are in Christ and who have Christ in them. Because we bring Christ into our relationships. We bring Christ into our families. We bring Christ into our communities. Now, we need to get this really clear, brothers and sisters, because we live in a society which has lots of good, well-meaning, altruistic people and lots of organisations, myriads of organisations that are helping the poor and the needy and who knows what. And all that's good as far as it goes. But we must not make the mistake that that's the first thing. The first thing is Christ. Let me remind you of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 14. Paul says, it's the love of Christ that compels us, because we're convinced that one has died for all, and therefore all have died. But those who live, he says, should live no longer for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. That's the Christian life. We're convinced that Christ died for all, and therefore all died, therefore I died, therefore you died. It's not your life anymore. The life you live now is not your life. It's not yours to rule. It's not yours to decide. It's Christ's life. You died with him. You're dead. And the life you've got is entirely dependent upon him. It's his life, not yours. The love of Christ compels us, because we're convinced that one died for all, and therefore all died. And he died for all so that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him. The person and the people who make the crucial impact in the evil civil war are not the altruists. They're not the compassionate. They're not the benefactors, good as all that may be, and mostly is. Nor are they the Christian isolates who keep to themselves and don't want to get contaminated by the bad world outside. Nor are they the lone rangers. The crucial impact is made by those who live for God because Christ is in them, whose life comes from the daily refreshing of his presence through word and spirit and through the fellowship of his people, whose life embodies Christ himself, whose greatest desire is God, who offer themselves to God. This is verse 13. Offer yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and offer every part of yourself to him as an instrument of righteousness. They're the ones that make the impact, who are most interested in God, who are most interested in Christ, who offer themselves to him so that he can do his works of righteousness in them and through them. The poor, the poverty of our community is a big issue for our society, but its partner is self-focused living. It's interesting, these two things go together in our society, do they not? A lack of community and a huge preoccupation with self-interest and self-pleasure. But the people who are truly baptised into Christ, they're the people who are alive to God in Christ. And they're the ones who will bring God's mind and love and righteousness into all parts of the civil war. They'll bring it into their families, and they'll bring it into other people's families as they connect with them, because the grace and love of Christ will just come from them, because that's their life. And they'll bring it into the church. How much we need to strengthen the church, the gathering of God's people. Well, just by being present is a start. Be present, brothers and sisters. Well, I might be talking to the choir. I'm not talking just. Be present. Be here every week. Be here to encourage and pray for all the others. Do you know, the average attendance at this church is 7 weeks out of 10. You might think that's quite good. But if you subtract the clergy and the choir out of that, it's closer to number 6. That's nearly every second week. And that's true across the board. Worse in some places. How can the church grow and be built up if people only meet every second week? And we need to meet face to face, so we encourage and speak to each other and pray for each other and read the Bible together. But in our society, the people who are filled with Christ, on the P&C, in the local community groups, in politics, people like Patricia Hurricane. I've said this before, let me say it again, let me promote this again. Patricia Hurricane is a formerly lecturer at Sydney University, and she calls herself a sexologist. I think there's probably a fancier name than that. She's produced these little books for parents to read to their kids. This is for children between, I think, 7 and 10. Me and my family, me and my body. This is all to do with sexual abuse and teaching children, learning about pornography. You want to teach your children who are 8 about pornography? Yes, because they're already looking at it. Learning about sex. Wonderful little books for 7 to 10-year-olds to read to kids. She reckons that most of the people who buy this are grandparents. Well, parents. Grandparents, get them and give them to them. People like that. People who are involved in the political sphere, in education, in unions, in workplaces, who are helping the underlying causes of violence and addiction in whatever ways they can, in dysfunctional and poor life experience families. A grandfather this week said that his grandson had got in with kids and with the wrong crowd, kids who are part of the wrong crowd, drowned in the river. There's great potential amongst us here, is there not, to keep on bringing the love of Christ, transforming a corrupt civil war society with the presence of Christ. That's the crucial thing. The first thing is not the method, not the grouping. We've got some teams setting up, and some of those teams, I think, will do some brilliant work if we allow God to lead us into things we haven't tried before, consolidate things we have tried. But the first thing is not the technique. The first thing is Christ. Make sure Christ is living in you. Make sure that the most important thing for you is to live for God, to please Him, to know Him, to fill your heart and your mind with His Word. Make sure your spirit is in it. Make sure you're meeting with other brothers and sisters to be encouraged and to build each other up. Because you see, as we grow together and strengthen each other, that will be of great assistance to all of the people filled with Christ, living with Christ in them, who are bringing His love to others. Because the more you do that, the more difficult it is, isn't it? Those of you who struggle with caring and doing stuff in that society, it's hard work to persevere. It's draining, it's battering. And we need support and encouragement from one another. The Lord is calling us to do this, I believe, because He always calls His people to bring His love to whoever they meet, outside the walls as well as inside. God's grace abounds to overcome the corruption in our own lives. More about that another time. But the love and the life of Christ in us is the light and the salt that will change the society around us, the people around us, and even in some cases the structures. Praying, getting involved, being supported. But it's the grace of God to depend on. God's presence in Christ, that you're in Christ, baptized into his death, brought to life. It's not your life anymore, but Christ's life. Let's keep on being people in God's grace abounds. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, that you, through Christ's death and resurrection and the gift of your Spirit, you've enabled us to not let sin dominate in our own lives, but also because of that, we can be people who bring Christ and his love to others. And through that wonderful gospel, see other lives transformed. We pray that you will help us to be those people who bring Christ and live Christ. We pray it in his name.